walking away. This is Renovation of the Heart Book Club, Chapter 2, Question 3. What are the 6 basic aspects or dimensions of the human being? Does the list leave out anything?
Okay, now we're getting into it.
Yeah, here's the meat. Who wants to list them? Luke, you want to list them?
Sure. Let me flip back to a nice little list. So these together, maybe I'll just start with quote. These together and in interplay make up the human nature. Number 1, thought, images, concepts, judgments, inference. Thoughts, meaning, images, concepts, judgments, and inferences. Number 2, feeling, which is sensations, emotions. Number 3, choice, will, decision, which is will, decision, or character. Number 4, body, which makes up of actions, interactions with the physical world. Number 5, social context, personal and structural, which is personal and structural relations to others. Soul, the factor that integrates all of the other aspects to form one life.
That's the first half of the question.
I find it interesting that he brings attention to the mystery and the mysteriousness of the self as he tries to kind of unveil the mysteriousness of the human self. His section header, it says the human self is not mysterious. And he kind of goes into the details of what that all entails. And by separating it out into these different categories, it helps to address each one individually and kind of bring, as the soul does, kind of brings all these aspects into one.
And there's this interesting tension between the mysteriousness of nature and the mysteriousness of self. It's like our natures aren't really that mysterious, as Willard points out, but ourselves are deeply mysterious. There are things about everyone that just completely incomprehensible, not even incomprehensible, just ignorant. Like there are parts of myself that I don't know anything about. That's true for everyone. And it may be a blessing that I'm ignorant of those parts of myself, because they may be so horrifying to me in my present condition, that if I knew those things about myself, what I was capable of under certain circumstances, that I would be paralyzed by that knowledge. Again, I think that's something that's generally true of the human condition, which is why it's a mercy of God that He doesn't reveal everything about us, all our sin to us, in one fell swoop. Because I think Dallas Willard's words in the previous chapter was turn us to stone. We would just freeze. But on the other hand, that idea that there are pieces of myself that, in cooperation with Christ, that I'm seeking out to bring care to heal, under His shepherding, if you will, to use some of His imagery, is intensely motivating. The fact that there will always be something, some way to grow, some things to learn about and improve upon. And it may be weird for a perfectionist to say something like this, but that gets me going as well. The idea that there's always going to be something to work on until I'm made perfect, and that perfection is promised to me. We like that a lot.
One point I think that is important is it's important to kind of clarify where Willard is coming from with this list, and so I'm just going to read top of page 25. Simply put, every human being thinks, has a thought life, feels, chooses, interacts with his body, his or her body, and its social context, and more or less integrates all the foregoing parts as part of one life. The idea of the spiritual life and the Christian understanding is one where all of the essential parts of the human self are effectively organized around God as they're restored and sustained by Him. So I think that it's easy if we just lifts off these 6 parts as to think of them as sort of battling with each other and not in union. But Willard's point here is that they're all part of a greater whole, and it's just we can identify certain specific aspects of ourselves, but they're operating in unison. Which I think is just a good clarifying point to understand where he's coming from. And this is sort of where we get into the beginning of the book itself, because he's then going to break down how we actually should approach each of these aspects of ourselves. And that approach is how we renovate our heart. Like this is where we actually get into the meat and potatoes and everything.
I guess that begs the question then, does this list leave anything out?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I think that you could use any number of models for the aspects of the human, but I think that this is pretty all-encompassing, and I like Willard's model. I like, obviously, it's just something that he came up with, so it's not perfect, but I think that it's an interesting and helpful way to view ourselves, especially in this pursuit of spiritual formation.
I would say it's fairly comprehensive, but not, as we were discussing about Jesus, God naming himself to Moses, it's not so big picture that it's impossible to sort of grasp by a human mind and act upon. Because we could say that the nature of a human being is God. We're just God images in flesh. But that's not, it's true and it's accurate, but it's not actionable. And I think that this list is granular enough to be actionable, but not so granular that it would result in sort of navel-gazing self-introspection that devolves into something like a spiritual hypochondria. I can tell you want to break down spiritual hypochondria. Ask your question.
What? Sorry. Oh. Perhaps, sorry, if you can restate.
Spiritual hypochondria?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, for the benefit of our readers, and maybe you, Luke, I'll just define hypochondria.
Please.
So it's this.
It's like in biology so much.
Well, see, that's the funny part because it's not biological.
What? Okay.
It's a psychological phenomenon whereby someone thinks that they're sick all the time. Everything that happens to them is some symptom of some horrifying disease. So, the spiritual equivalent is that it's every thought that presents itself to me, if it's not a perfect thought, as far as I understand perfection, is a result of sin. So, if you think an uncharitable thought, or an uncharitable thought presents itself to your mind for contemplation, we will say, to stick with Dallas Willard's formation of how thoughts, the mechanics of a thought life, so some uncharitable thought presents itself to you for contemplation. That is not sin yet, but it's someone who is over, hyperfixated on symptoms of spiritual sin might say that having the fact that an uncharitable thought presented itself to their mind for contemplation was a sin, and that kicks off actual sin by their insistence that usually it results in some form of penance when you think you've sinned for spiritual hypochondriac. I'm speaking from experience here because I'm a 21st century Pharisee, but so when I say an uncharitable thought, we'll give an example. It's say someone is badly dressed, and I see them and I notice that they are badly dressed, and I think something along the lines of, they have terrible style, they must not care about how they present themselves to the world. That is not a charitable thing to think. I have not yet sinned because that thought presented itself to my mind for contemplation. In we'll say the mode of spiritual hypochondria, which has happened frequently, I would think that is an uncharitable thought. I'm a bad person for having had that thought present itself to me and having agreed with it. Therefore, because I'm a bad person, I deserve to be punished. I reject God's mercy and put myself on the judgment throne, on the judgment seat, saying, hey, Ryan, you've had this uncharitable thought, that makes you a bad person, you deserve punishment. And so I'll do that. That punishment usually takes the form of more what we'll call outward acts of sinfulness that I know are wrong and that I use as a punishment for myself. And so that's sort of...
It's just like the snake that eats itself.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's terrible.
But it's good that I'm aware of it.
Sure.
Because everyone does that.
Sure.
Everyone puts themselves to some extent and in some way in God's place as judge of either themselves or others, most usually and most dangerously of themselves, because we have the most power over ourselves, and that's where, sort of back to the role of the heart is to redirect that sort of self-flagellation, wherein we put ourselves in God's place to judge and to execute that judgment upon ourselves, in sort of this negative, it's a positive feedback loop of punishment, penance, and judgment of self that just results in a life characterized by sin and hopelessness, which is not the life that we're called to as children of God. We're called to a life of sure hope in the goodness and action of God to bring about salvation and therefore sanctification in our lives.
So not positive meaning good, but positive meaning
the signal increases as it goes.
Right.
So every input makes the response more.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Right, yeah.
Sure.
So positive feedback loops are systems in which you get an input, the response of that system is to increase that input for the next cycle. So think of, for math, like a sine wave. So you get this sinusoid signal coming in, and there's a black box of the system. Don't know necessarily what's happening inside the black box, but one of two things will happen. Either it's a positive feedback loop, wherein input is, we'll say, an amplitude of 1 for the ease of explanation, goes into the system, black box happens, comes out 1.5, and then goes back into the box, and it comes out 2.25, and it does that forever and ever. And that's just, if you do that in a way that is unrighteous, that's hell. Eventually that just becomes hell. Alternatively, and this is where the mind comes into play, and the heart directs the mind in this way. Like, you get to choose the nature of the feedback system that you participate in. It's a negative feedback loop where some signal, in this case, say a simple thought, comes in and it's at a certain amplitude, hits the box, black box, don't know what's happening, comes out 0.75. We've reduced the severity, the amplitude of the signal by having a proper approach to the thought that occurs to us, which is to say, yes, I acknowledge that thought was uncharitable. The fact that I've had an uncharitable thought does not make me a bad person. In fact, the fact that I have understood that this thought is uncharitable is a good sign. But I must respond to this in a way that is appropriate and good. Back to your definition of a well-kept heart is one that understands, yes, that is not a good thought to have had. That doesn't make me a bad person for having had it. What I should do with this thought is say, hey, Jesus, hey God, I've had this uncharitable thought. I understand that this thought is uncharitable. I need you to help me have more charitable thoughts. And then to ask him on a consistent basis, how can I have more charitable thoughts? And specifically, with this situation that caused me to have uncharitable thoughts, what would a charitable thought be? And in the moment of having those thoughts, to say, hey God, what's a charitable thought to have here? And that is when Paul says that we should pray without ceasing, that's what he's talking about. There's every single thought is an opportunity for two things. One, to be grateful, and two, to pray. And what I mean by being grateful is that, just as we were discussing, is the fact that we have understood that the thought we have just had is an opportunity to thank God for a mind that is capable of comprehending it, for a heart that is well tuned enough to goodness to understand its opposite. And that is a thing for which we can and should be very grateful. But it's also, like I said, an opportunity for prayer to ask God for his help to be more like what we want to be, which is more like he wants us to be.
What's crazy is when you ask earnestly like that, he really does. I mean, I can attest to how he really will give you these thoughts if you ask him.
Yeah.
That's just kind of the interplay between two different aspects of what Willard's talking about, is these thoughts and your will. It's important to separate them like that and to see how they interact with each other, and then how they come together into the soul.
Right. And there's opportunity for that kind of interplay in every other aspect of human, what Dallas Willard calls human flourishing. And I think that's good for this one. Unless, Dustin, you have anything to add?
I don't think so. I think we've kind of highlighted some of the aspects. We can go into them in greater depth in the next question.